My father gestured at my husband and said my sister was in love with him in front of everyone. My mother's old stopwatch used to smack the kitchen counter like a judge's gavel, marking the beginning of every childhood battle. But nothing could have prepared me for the day my family tried to publicly humiliate my husband, using my sister as their weapon, and then blamed me for finally fighting back. That sound, the click and snap of that stopwatch, did something to my nervous system that I still can't explain without sounding dramatic. She'd flip it over, click the button, and then declare, "Go!" like we were in some bizarre boot camp talent show where the only prize was not getting yelled at. This was just normal. She wasn't screaming 24/7, but everything had a timer. Homework, chores, even how fast we could put away groceries. She'd tell people she was just teaching discipline, and they'd nod like it was wholesome because she had this calm, clipped way of talking that made you feel dumb for questioning her. My father? He'd be in the doorway, work boots still on, looking tired and quiet, and he'd do that little shrug that meant, let her handle it. And yes, I still resent him for that. I'm working on it, kind of. There were two of us, me and my sister. I'm Delaney, the older one. And by older, I mean I got exactly 1 year of being an only child before I had a tiny shadow following me around, copying the way I held a spoon. When we were little, we actually got along. We'd build blanket forts and whisper about made-up monsters in the hallway. Sometimes I'd even let her win board games on purpose, just because she'd get this fierce little face, like losing was a personal betrayal. My mother noticed everything. So of course she noticed that too. She'd say things like, "Delaney's so considerate." But the way she said it always came with a side of, "And you, younger ones, should be more like her." It was subtle at first, like a slow leak you don't realize is ruining the floor until the boards warp. Once we hit elementary school, I was the kid who loved reading and math. It came easy. I didn't even work that hard at it. That's the part that still makes me feel guilty, because it wasn't like I was some saintly, hard-working genius. I was just good at the stuff teachers rewarded. My sister, on the other hand, loved anything that involved moving. Sports, dancing in the living room, drawing cartoons with dramatic muscles and impossible hair. My mother didn't care about any of that. She cared about grades. So dinner became this weird performance, where my mother would ask about our day. And if my sister hesitated, my mother would glance at me and say, "Your sister understood it. Why didn't you?" And I'd sit there, food in my mouth, wanting to vanish, because I knew whatever I said could be used as a weapon. My sister started ripping up her own drawings, full-on tearing paper with tears in her eyes, saying they were stupid. And it wasn't because I said anything mean. I didn't. I was the kind of kid who apologized when someone else bumped into me. But the comparison was constant, and she started looking at me like I was the reason she felt small. I remember one night she whispered, "I hate you." And then 5 minutes later, she crawled into my bed because she was scared of the dark. That was our childhood in a nutshell. Love and resentment tangled together, and me learning early that being the good one didn't feel good at all. By middle school, the competition stopped being cute and started being ugly. My mother had these consequences she believed in. If my sister failed a test, dessert disappeared for a week. If she lied about finishing homework, she'd stand in the corner of the living room until her legs shook. My mother called it accountability. My sister called them punishments once. And my mother went ice cold and said, "Don't be dramatic." Which is hilarious because dramatic is basically my family's native language. There were nights my mother made me sit at the table with my sister and tutor her. Picture two kids, exhausted with a workbook open and my mother pacing behind us like a referee. My sister would stare at the page, then at me, and I could feel her anger building because she thought I was judging her. I wasn't judging her. I was scared. I'd explain something. She'd snap, "Stop talking to me like I'm dumb." And my mother would slam a cabinet and say, "See, Delaney understands it. You can too if you stop acting like a baby." And then my sister would cry, and I'd feel like the villain, even though I was literally doing what I was told. I started doing her assignments. I'm not proud. I'd take her worksheet after she went to bed, erase the messy answers, and fill them in neatly. I'd hide it under my pillow so my mother wouldn't find it too early. Then I'd hand it back and whisper, "Just turn it in." Sometimes it worked. Sometimes my mother would quiz her and my sister would freeze. And then we'd both get punished because my mother decided we were conspiring. The thing that makes me laugh now in a bitter way is that my mother would say, I can't believe you'd do something like that. Like we were plotting a bank robbery and not just trying to survive 7th grade. My father witnessed all of it. He'd walk in from work, see my sister crying at the table, see my mother glaring, see me sitting there like a hostage, and he'd say things like, maybe take it easy, but softly, like he didn't want to poke the bear. Then he'd go watch television in the other room. My sister never aimed her rage at him, though. She aimed it at me. I became this symbol of everything she felt she couldn't be. Calm, smart, easy. She'd tell me, you love it when I mess up. And I'd swear I didn't, and she'd roll her eyes like I was lying. One day, I found her locked in the bathroom, crying with her face pressed against a towel. When I asked what was wrong, she said, I wish I was actually stupid so they'd stop expecting things. I didn't know what to say to that. I just sat on the floor outside the door and told her I loved her, and she didn't say it back. That was the first time I realized this wasn't just sibling rivalry. This was something that could break her. There's one scene I can still taste, like it's stuck in the back of my throat. My sister had gotten a quiz back with a big red mark on top, and my mother made her sit at the table while she cooked dinner, repeating the same question over and over. My sister's cheeks were wet, and she kept wiping them with the back of her hand like she was embarrassed to be crying in front of food. I tried to step in and say, she understands it now. And my mother snapped. Then why didn't she understand it before? Like my sister's brain was a moral failure. I remember stirring a pot with one hand and holding my sister's workbook with the other, thinking, this is not normal. And also thinking, if I say that out loud, we're all dead. The worst part is that my sister would do this thing where she'd laugh, a little snort, when she was overwhelmed. It made my mother furious. My mother would say, you think this is funny? And my sister would shake her head and laugh harder because she couldn't help it. And then I'd jump in and say, she's not laughing at you, like I was a translator for my own sister's nervous system. My father would stroll in, see it, and ask what we wanted for dinner. I wanted to scream, I want a different life. But instead I'd say, whatever. Because I didn't even know I was allowed to want something else. A few weeks before I left for the state university nearby, my father called me at around 3 a.m, and his voice sounded like somebody had scooped out his insides. He didn't say hello. He just said my sister was in the hospital. I threw on whatever clothes were on the chair in my room and ran out. The drive there felt like it took both 5 minutes and 5 years. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and cheap coffee, and the lights were so bright it felt like punishment. My sister was hooked up to monitors, pale and sweaty, and my mother was sitting rigid in a plastic chair like she was trying not to move a muscle. My father looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. They told me she'd taken too much of my mother's sleep medication. She survived. That's the only sentence that matters. But everything around it still plays in my head like a bad loop. The nurse asking questions. The doctor explaining, watchful waiting. My mother's face when she realized this wasn't a phase or a bad attitude she could correct with consequences. My sister's eyes fluttering open and then closing again, like she was exhausted by living. After that, my parents did what people do when something horrible forces them to admit reality. They tried to fix it fast. Therapy, family counseling, fresh starts. My mother cried in front of a stranger for the first time in my life. She said she'd projected her own military frustration onto us, that she'd thought pressure would make us strong. The therapist asked me how I felt, and I wanted to scream that I felt like a tool, like a measuring stick, like a weapon my mother wielded and my sister hated. Instead, I said, I just want her to be okay, because that was true and also safer. At one session, I looked at my sister and said I was sorry for every time my existence made her feel like she wasn't enough. It sounded cheesy out loud, but it was the best I had. My sister stared at the carpet and nodded. She didn't cry. She didn't hug me. My mother cried enough for all 3 of us. Later, in the parking lot, my sister said, "You didn't do this." Then she got in the car and put her headphones on like the conversation was over. And I remember feeling relieved and also sad because even the forgiveness she gave me felt distant. I left for college anyway, because what else was I supposed to do? I moved into a tiny apartment with roommates who left dishes in the sink and played music too loud. And part of me loved it because no one was timing me. But every time my phone buzzed, I was afraid it was another call from my father saying my sister was back in the hospital. I'd sit in class, take notes, and then my brain would drift to her. I'd feel guilty for being free. Guilt became my hobby. Super healthy. My sister texted me a few days after I moved into my college place. She sent a selfie that looked normal, like she was trying to prove she was fine. And then she wrote, "Don't forget me." That sentence hit me harder than anything the therapist said. I stared at my phone and felt my chest tighten. Because how do you promise someone you won't forget them when you're also trying to live your own life? I texted back that I loved her and that I was proud of her. And she responded with a thumbs up emoji, like we were coworkers. That's when I started to realize she didn't know how to be close to me without it feeling like competition. In my dorm, people complained about their parents being annoying or strict, and I'd laugh along. But inside, I was thinking, you don't even know strict. Then I'd feel guilty for thinking that because pain is pain. And also because I didn't want to become that person who turns trauma into a personality. But I couldn't stop measuring everything against my house because my house was the only ruler I had. My sister graduated high school with decent enough grades to get a diploma. But the second anyone mentioned more school, community college, a technical program, anything, she'd panic like she was being dragged back into the deep end. Once my mother suggested a design course because my sister still drew constantly, and my sister's breathing went weird and fast. She locked herself in her room, and I heard her sobbing through the door, saying she couldn't do it. She couldn't be watched again. She couldn't be compared again. My parents were terrified of another hospital night, so they backed off completely. That's how the pendulum swung. My sister went from being pressured to being handled like glass. My parents stopped asking her to do anything that might trigger her. She got jobs at a coffee shop, then a clothing store, then a front desk position somewhere. And each time it lasted a couple of months before there was drama, an argument with a manager, a panic attack in the stockroom, calling out sick too many days. Every time she got fired or quit, she'd come home and cry and say she was a failure. And my parents would rush to comfort her like she was still 12. They paid her bills. They bought her groceries. They told her she was healing. Meanwhile, I was juggling classes, part-time work, and roommates who thought rent was optional. My parents also started slipping money into every conversation about her like it was casual, but it was always loaded. They'd say things like, "We helped with her rent this month," or "We covered her car payment," and then look at me like I was supposed to clap. It never came with conditions for her, only for me. The unspoken rule was that I had to keep my life small and manageable so they could keep bailing her out of whatever disaster she'd created, without anyone ever saying the words out loud. By the time I was done with school, I had a steady job at a small tech company. Not glamorous, just regular office life. Emails, meetings, too much coffee. My father would brag about it to relatives like he'd personally coded my projects. My mother would say, "We always knew Delaney would land on her feet." And my sister would sit there quiet, scrolling on her phone, and you could feel the tension like a low hum. I wanted to be happy for myself, but it felt like celebrating was a crime in our house. A couple of months after my sister got her first job after high school, my parents floated an idea that should have made me laugh, but it didn't because my family has a talent for saying outrageous things with a straight face. My mother called me and said, "Your sister is struggling and she needs a fresh start." And I said, "Okay," like an idiot, because I thought she meant therapy or a new job, or maybe a different apartment. Then my mother said, "We were thinking she could stay with you for a while." I stared at my wall like it might answer for me. I told her I lived with roommates and had no extra space. She said, "Then once you have your own place." I said, "Mom, I'm in college. I can't even afford to breathe." She got quiet, and then she pulled out the guilt, soft and slow. "You're her sister. You're all she has." That line still makes me want to roll my eyes and scream at the same time, because she said it like my father didn't exist. Like my mother herself wasn't the reason my sister's mental health turned into a fragile emergency. But sure, yes, I'm all she has. Love being assigned responsibility for another adult's life. Truly, it became this recurring thing. Every time my sister had drama at a job, my mother would hint at her moving in with me. When I got my first small apartment after college, my mother brought it up within a month. She could take the couch, my mother said. She wouldn't be in the way, my father added, like my home was a waiting room. I said no. I said, "No, So many times it started to sound like my only vocabulary word. My parents acted like I was being cruel and selfish, and my sister acted like I'd insulted her. She'd send me messages that were half emotional blackmail, half threat. I guess I'm just a burden. I know you think I'm pathetic. If something happens to me, I hope you can live with it. That last one made my hand shake. I showed it to my husband, and he said, "That's manipulation." I said, "I know." And then I still felt guilty because manipulation works when you grew up trained to respond to it. My husband wanted me to block her right then. I didn't. I told myself I was being compassionate. I told myself I could handle it. I, in fact, could not handle it. One night, my sister showed up at my apartment without warning. She rang the buzzer like she owned the place. I opened the door and she stood there with a bag and this forced smile, and she said, "Surprise!" I said, "What are you doing?" She shrugged and said, "Mom said it would be fine." Like my mother's permission mattered more than mine. I felt my chest tighten. I told her she couldn't stay. She said, "You can't do this to me," and started crying right there in the hallway. Neighbors walked by and looked at us like it was a show. I felt embarrassed and furious. And then I did the thing I always do when I'm overwhelmed. I snapped. I said, "You don't get to show up and make me the villain because you can't respect boundaries." She stared at me like I'd slapped her. Then she turned around and walked out, sobbing loudly so everyone could hear. My phone blew up with calls from my mother and father. My mother said, "How could you?" My father said, "She needs you." And I remember sitting on my couch after, staring at my hands, thinking, if this is what happens when I say no, what happens when I say yes? That was the night I realized my parents had built a system where my sister's needs were infinite, and my role was to absorb them. I started breaking that system piece by piece, and it was messy and loud, and honestly kind of terrifying. I met my future husband at a work conference. He was freelance, did computer security stuff, and he had that relaxed confidence that made people lean in when he talked. He wasn't flashy or arrogant, just comfortable in his own skin. I liked that. It made me feel like maybe I could become that kind of person, too. When I brought him to meet my family, my sister suddenly became this version of herself I barely recognized. She was overly sweet, laughing too loud, asking him a million questions about his hobbies, touching his arm like she was just being friendly. My mother watched it like it was adorable. My father made jokes about how extroverted people pair well, and winked at nobody in particular. I smiled so hard my jaw hurt. Later, while doing dishes, my mother told me this funny story about a mistake my father made years ago with a neighbor, and how they moved past it with forgiveness. She said it like she was planting a flag. Like, "See, we're the kind of people who forgive." I remember the soap on my hands, the slippery plate, the way my stomach dropped. I didn't even ask questions. I just filed it away, because something in me already knew it would come back. That's the thing about family secrets. They sit in the corners, waiting for the right moment to jump out and ruin your day. There was this stretch where my parents started calling me, not to check in, but to update me on my sister's feelings like I was her emotional manager. "She's having a rough week," my mother would say. "She feels like you don't care." Meanwhile, I was paying rent, working overtime, and trying to build a life. And I'd hang up the phone and sit in my car for a minute, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me from floating away. I cared. I cared so much it made me sick. But I also resented being drafted into fixing problems I didn't create. That mix of love and resentment is honestly the most exhausting emotion on earth. The day of my wedding was supposed to be simple. Not a fairy tale, just a nice rented hall, some food, a playlist, people we cared about. I was nervous in that normal way where your hands shake while you try to zip a dress. Right before the ceremony, my father pulled my fiancé aside into the hallway. I didn't know until later. At the time, I was busy trying not to cry my mascara off and pretending my mother's comments about standing up straight weren't getting under my skin. On our honeymoon, nothing fancy, just a couple of days in a small rental near the water, my husband told me what my father said. My father had asked if he was really sure, if he wasn't rushing, if he understood the responsibility of marrying into our family. He said my father's tone was polite, but the timing felt like sabotage, like my father wanted to plant doubt right before the vows. I laughed at first because it sounded so absurd. Then I got furious. I cried on the edge of the bed and said, "Why would he do that?" My husband shrugged and said, "It felt like he was questioning whether you were the right choice." That sentence hit me like a slap, because I had felt that my whole life, but hearing it out loud made it real. After we got back, my sister had a birthday dinner at my parents' house. My mother insisted my husband take a bunch of photos with my sister. Just one, she kept saying, like she was begging for a kidney. She never asks for anything, which, by the way, is a lie. She asked for everything. She just did it in a way that made my parents feel like heroes. My husband said no, calmly, and my mother's face tightened. My father joked, "Come on, it's harmless." My sister did this little pout, like she was the wounded one. I snapped. I said, "He's my husband, not a party prop." My mother gasped like I'd slapped her. My father muttered something about me being too sensitive. My husband took my hand and said we were leaving. The car ride home was silent in that thick, angry way. Then I started ranting, and once I started, I couldn't stop. I listed every weird comment, every forced moment, every time my sister hovered too close. My husband listened and said, "It's not in your head." And that should have made me feel validated. But it mostly made me feel sick, because if it wasn't in my head, then it was real. And if it was real, then my parents were either blind or complicit. Spoiler, it was complicit. We started keeping receipts, screenshots of messages, notes in my phone with dates and details. I hated that we had to do that because it felt paranoid. But it also felt like the only way to protect myself from the inevitable, "You're exaggerating" speech. I told myself we'd just avoid family gatherings for a while until things cooled down. I didn't realize things in my family didn't cool down. They either exploded or simmered forever. At first, I told myself my sister was just being awkward. Like maybe she was overcompensating because she didn't know how to make conversation with a new person. Then she started finding reasons to text me questions that were really questions for him. What kind of music does he like? Does he prefer spicy food? Is he into hiking? It was like she was trying to assemble him in her head piece by piece. When I'd answer vaguely, she'd say, "You're so secretive," and laugh. And I'd laugh back, because I didn't want to be the paranoid sister. I wanted to be normal. I wanted to be the kind of woman who doesn't have to guard her marriage from her own family. Spoiler, I did not get that. After my wedding, the pressure shifted again, because now my family wasn't just trying to pull me back into the old dynamics. They were trying to pull my husband into them, too. My mother would call him directly sometimes, which already felt wrong. And she'd do this sugary voice like she was being friendly. She'd ask him to help my sister set up her computer, or fix something on her phone, or explain how to apply for jobs online. He'd politely say he was busy, and then my mother would call me and say he sounded annoyed. "Are you sure he's good for you?" Like she was auditioning for the role of saboteur-in-chief. My father had his own style. He'd invite my husband to guy talks in the garage like they were bonding. But the conversation always drifted to my sister. "She really looks up to you," my father would say. "You're good for her confidence." My husband would nod politely, then come home and look at me like, "Are they serious?" I'd shrug like, "This is my life. Sorry." And then I'd feel angry at myself for shrugging, because shrugging was how I survived. But it was also how things kept happening. There was one holiday dinner where my sister wore this dress that was almost identical to mine from the year before. Same color, same cut, same everything. It might sound petty to notice, but it wasn't just the dress. It was the way she sat next to my husband, not me. It was the way my mother kept saying twins and laughing. It was the way my father took photos and said perfect, like he liked the visual of my husband next to her. I smiled through it because I was still in my don't cause a scene era, and then I went home and cried in the shower because I felt like I was losing my mind. After that, my husband started insisting on leaving earlier whenever we visited. He'd say he had a client call or we had errands, and my mother would pout like a child and say, "But you just got here." My sister would watch him like he was a door she wanted to keep open. In the car, my husband would be quiet for a few minutes. Then he'd say, "They're trying to make me responsible for her happiness." And I'd say yes. And then we'd sit with that for a while because it's a weird thing to admit out loud. Your parents are basically treating your marriage like a communal resource. That's when I started having these small, ugly fantasies. Not fantasies like I wanted to hurt anyone, But fantasies like I wanted to scream at my parents in a restaurant and see them flinch. Like I wanted to post every weird message my sister sent and let people judge her. Like I wanted to throw my mother's stopwatch into the street and watch a car run it over. I'd feel ashamed of those thoughts, but they were also a sign I was finally getting angry instead of just sad. Anger is uncomfortable, but it's also protective. It's the part of you that says, this is not okay, even when everyone around you is begging you to accept it. And then because my family loves timing, my job got stressful right when all of this was escalating. We had layoffs. People were tense. My boss started putting more work on me because I was reliable. I'd come home exhausted, and then I'd have missed calls from my mother. And then I'd stare at my phone like it was a grenade. Some nights I'd snap at my husband for chewing too loud. Some nights I'd drink too much wine and spiral. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not pretending I was a calm, enlightened person either. I was a woman trying to hold a life together while my family tried to pull it apart with smiles on their faces. The anniversary party wasn't the first public humiliation. It was just the one that finally broke my patience. After we left, my mother tried a new tactic, pretending she was sick. She texted my husband, not me, saying she'd had chest pain from stress and that she hoped he could talk sense into me. When he didn't respond, she texted me and said, "If anything happens to me, I hope you can live with yourself." That sentence again. Same shape, different mouth. I stared at it and felt like I was 13, cornered in my bedroom, being told my feelings were dangerous. I did respond that time. I wrote this long message where I tried to be calm and clear and adult. I said I loved them, but I wasn't going to tolerate disrespect, and I wasn't going to accept my sister treating my husband like an emotional support object. I said if they wanted a relationship with me, they needed to stop making jokes and start acknowledging reality. My mother replied with one line, "You're so sensitive." I threw my phone onto the couch like it had personally insulted me. It kind of did. A few days later, my father showed up at my work. Not inside, but in the parking lot, leaning against his car like he was waiting for me after school. I walked out, saw him, and my stomach dropped. He said he wanted to talk. I said, "Here." He said, "Now." He looked tired, but also stubborn. He told me I was tearing the family apart. I told him the family had been torn for years. They'd just taped it together with denial. He said my sister was fragile. I said, "She's an adult." He said, "You don't understand." And that's when I laughed because of the audacity. I said, "I've understood my whole life. You're the one who doesn't want to see it." He tried to drag out the hospital night like a weapon. He said, "Do you want that again?" And my throat tightened because of course that fear still lived in me. I hated him for using it. I said, "Stop weaponizing her mental health to control me." He flinched like the truth stung. Then he did something that surprised me. He admitted quietly that he'd always been scared of my mother. He said it like it was an excuse, like I couldn't stop her because I was scared. I stared at him and felt this wave of disgust and sadness because, okay, I get fear, but you still have responsibilities when you're a parent. You still don't get to disappear while your kids drown. He left without an apology. He just said, "Think about what you're doing," and drove away. I stood there in my work clothes with my lunch bag in my hand, feeling humiliated and furious and weirdly hollow. I went back inside and tried to act normal in meetings while my brain replayed his words. That night, I snapped at my husband over something stupid, then cried and apologized, then snapped again. My husband held my face and said, "Your family is not going to change unless you force them to." I said, "I know." And then I still hated how true it was. The next time my sister's letter arrived, I didn't even read it. I ripped it in half and threw it away. And then I burst into tears like I just murdered something. My husband pulled me into his arms and said, "You're allowed to be done." That sentence felt like permission I'd never been given. Being done. Not negotiating, not proving, not explaining, just done. I didn't fully believe I could do it yet, but I wanted to. Over the next year, we declined invitations like it was our side hustle. Birthday dinners, random Sunday lunches, holiday stuff. We'd give excuses, work deadlines, being tired, maybe next time. And my mother would respond with these texts that made me want to throw my phone into a lake. My father would call and say, "Your mother misses you," like I was the one causing harm. Meanwhile, my sister never reached out directly. She'd just post vague, sad things online, and let my parents do the emotional labor of making me feel like a monster. And yes, I checked. I'm not proud, but I did. We all stalked the mess we're trying to avoid. We built our life anyway. We bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Not a mansion, not some fantasy. Just a place with a small yard and enough space that I didn't feel like I was living on top of my own stress. I got promoted at work. My husband got more clients. We were doing the boring adult thing where you pay bills and argue about groceries and feel proud when you remember to change the air filter. And for a little while it was peaceful. Like actually peaceful. I started to believe I could have a normal relationship with my parents if we kept things controlled and limited. Then my father called about my parents' anniversary party. A big one. Apparently they wanted the whole extended family there. My father said relatives were coming from out of state, and they'd ask questions if I didn't show up. My mother sent messages like, it would mean so much, and we've been through so much as a family, and don't punish us forever. I hated how she always phrased it like I was the punisher and she was the victim. I also miss my aunt, the one relative who always felt safe. The one who used to slip me extra cookies and tell me I wasn't crazy when my mother got intense. She hadn't visited in years. If I skipped the party, I'd miss her. My husband didn't want to go. He said he'd go if I really wanted, but he was tense about it in a way I could see in his shoulders. He suggested something that made my stomach twist. Maybe we should go on purpose. If they do it again in front of everyone, it won't be your word against theirs. He was right. It made sense, but I was terrified because I knew my family's specialty was public humiliation disguised as jokes. We talked through scenarios like we were planning a disaster drill. If my sister touched him, we'd leave. If my parents made jokes, we'd confront. If anyone tried to corner me alone, I'd text him a signal and he'd come get me. I wrote down points in my phone like I was preparing for a debate. I even bought a new outfit for the party, which sounds normal, except I did it with this weird, shaky feeling like I was dressing for a fight. The morning of the party, I sat on the edge of my bed and told myself, you're an adult. You can handle one dinner. And I almost believed it. The night before the party, I couldn't sleep, and I ended up cleaning the kitchen like a raccoon in a panic. I kept opening cabinets, closing them, checking if we had the locks double-checked, like any of that would protect me from my parents' mouths. My husband finally walked in and said, "You're spiraling." I snapped, "I'm not spiraling." And then immediately started crying because apparently I love proving people right. He wrapped his arms around me and said, "We go in, we stay calm. We don't let them write the story for us." The next morning, my mother called and acted like she was the injured party. She said my sister had cried all night because she felt rejected by my husband. I said, or maybe she shouldn't be asking for romantic validation from her sister's spouse. And my mother went silent like I'd spoken a foreign language. Then she said, "You're twisting it." My father got on the phone and said, "Don't be cruel." And I remember thinking, you're calling me cruel, but you're fine with humiliating me in my own marriage. That's when I started to understand that in my family, cruelty only counted when it was aimed at the fragile one. The party started off deceptively normal. My parents' house was decorated with old photos hung on strings with little clips. Like a scrapbook exploded in the living room. People hugged me and said they missed me. And I did that polite smile that looks friendly but keeps your soul inside your body. My aunt hugged me extra long and whispered, "Are you okay?" And I almost burst into tears right there. So yeah, that's where my emotional stability was. We sat at this long table, 15-ish people, give or take, passing dishes around. My sister was there, dressed up, acting shy. My mother kept patting her shoulder like she was soothing a nervous animal. At first, I thought maybe it'll be fine. Maybe my parents learned something. Then my aunt asked my sister casually if she was dating anyone. Just normal family small talk. My sister froze, fiddling with her napkin. A cousin teased her lightly, like, "Come on, spill." And then my father, with a drink in his hand, decided to entertain the table. He laughed and said my sister did have a crush. He pointed directly at my husband. Not subtly, not in a blink-and-you-miss-it way, like full finger, full grin. And then he added that she'd had a sweet little thing for him since she met him. My mother laughed too and said it was adorable, like it was a quirky hobby like collecting spoons. Somebody else laughed awkwardly. My husband's face went tight. My sister smiled like she was embarrassed. But I could see this flicker in her eyes that felt satisfied, like she liked the attention, even if it was humiliating. I felt this heat rush up my chest, and for a split second, I thought I might actually throw up on my plate. My mother looked at me like she was daring me to react. My father kept talking, making it sound like a funny family story. My aunt, bless her, looked confused and uncomfortable, like she'd accidentally stepped into a room where someone was arguing and nobody warned her. Someone joked about whether my husband had a single friend he could introduce to my sister, and the whole table tried to laugh like it wasn't weird. My husband stared at his fork like it was the most interesting thing in the world, and I could tell he was trying to stay calm for my sake. I remembered the plan. Breathe. Speak clearly. Don't cry. I set my napkin down and said, "So, we're doing this in front of everyone." My voice sounded steadier than I felt, which honestly surprised me. I looked at my mother and said, "You promised you'd stop." My mother opened her mouth, probably to say, "It's just a joke." And I cut her off because I was done waiting my whole life for permission to be upset. I turned to the table and asked, "Does anyone here think it's normal for a family to joke about someone having a crush on their sibling spouse?" Silence. Like complete silence. Forks paused. Someone cleared their throat. My father's smile slipped. My sister stared at me like I was ruining her big moment, and I felt something in me snap. Not like a breakdown, more like a door locking. I was done playing nice. Once I started talking, it poured out of me. I listed the little things. My sister hovering too close. My mother forcing photos. My father's comments about energy and pairing well. The way they'd acted like my marriage was a group project. I asked them why they thought it was funny to treat my husband like a prize my sister could dream about while I sat there smiling. My aunt's face went pale. A couple of relatives looked down at their plates like they wanted to melt into the wood. Someone tried to say, maybe it's harmless, but even they sounded unsure. My mother did that thing where she acts wounded to avoid accountability. Her eyes filled with tears, and she said, "We didn't mean anything by it. Like intent matters more than impact." My father puffed up and said I was overreacting. My sister finally spoke, voice shaking, and said, "It's not like I'm doing anything." And that exact line made me laugh. This sharp, ugly laugh I didn't recognize, because it was true. Technically, she wasn't kissing him at the table. She wasn't grabbing him. But she was letting them create this story where she was the tragic romantic and I was the uptight wife, and my parents were feeding it. My husband leaned in and said quietly, "Do you want to leave?" And I shook my head because no, not yet. Not this time. I looked at my father and said, "You tried to mess with him right before our wedding." The table collectively inhaled like that was the first real scandal sentence of the night. My father's eyes snapped to me. My mother's tears paused mid-fall. My aunt blinked fast like she was processing. My father said, "That's not what happened." And I said, "It is, and you know it." Then I did something impulsive. I said, "Maybe I should have taken your favorite word as far as you do. Forgiveness, right? Even cheating." My mother flinched, like I had slapped her. My father's face did that tight thing it does when he is pretending nothing is wrong. My husband looked straight at them and said, "Because your wife told Delaney you cheated on her years ago and she stayed. You turned that into a funny little story. Remember all about how love conquers everything. How far do boundaries go in this family? You cross them, then you tell people to get over it." It wasn't a rumor. My mother had told me about almost leaving him for a neighbor once in one of her soft, late-night moods where she liked to brag that they had survived so much. So I just handed their own story back to them without a bow and watched the color drain out of both of their faces. My mother made this choking sound. My father stood up, chair scraping, and said my husband was disrespectful. My mother started sobbing, accusing my husband of ruining their anniversary. My sister yelled that I always make everything about me, which was rich coming from someone whose entire personality had become being fragile and coddled. Someone's spouse tried to calm things down. Another relative started gathering purses and coats, like they were evacuating a storm. The room was chaos, and through all of it I felt weirdly calm. Not happy, not satisfied, just calm, like the worst thing had finally happened. And now I didn't have to dread it anymore. We stood up. My husband put his hand on the small of my back, and we walked toward the door while my parents yelled and my sister cried dramatically, and my aunt called my name like she wanted to stop me but didn't know how. At the doorway, I turned and said, "Don't contact me until you're ready to admit what you've done." My mother wailed like I'd announced a death. My father called me ungrateful. My sister shouted, "You're jealous," which made absolutely no sense, but whatever. We left. The cold air outside felt like relief and grief at the same time. The next few weeks were quiet in a way that felt unnatural. No calls, no dramatic messages, just silence. I kept checking my phone like a person waiting for a doctor's update. Even though I told myself I didn't want to hear from them, my aunt called and apologized. She said she hadn't known. She thought it was just teasing, and she sounded genuinely shaken. I believed her. She asked if my sister was okay mentally, and I said, "I don't know," because I truly didn't. And that answer made me feel like a monster, because what kind of sister says, "I don't know," after everything? But I couldn't keep carrying my sister's emotions like a backpack. I was exhausted. One cousin messaged me, saying they'd always thought my parents were weird about my sister, but they didn't know how deep it went. That message made me feel both validated and sad, because it meant other people saw it and still nobody intervened. To be fair, who wants to get between a mother and her golden child? Not me, apparently. My parents left 2 voicemails with this careful, controlled tone that sounded like they were reading from a script. My mother said she wanted to talk when emotions cooled. My father said he didn't appreciate being ambushed. Neither of them said sorry, not once. Then the letters started. Real paper letters. My sister somehow found my husband's business mailing address, and she began sending these handwritten notes that made my skin crawl. They weren't outright threats. They were worse. They were fantasy. She wrote about how connected they were, how she'd always understood him, how I didn't appreciate him. She wrote about dreams she had where they were together. She drew little hearts in the margins like a teenager. My husband showed me the first one with this stunned expression, like he was holding something radioactive. I read it and my hand shook. I wanted to laugh because it was so ridiculous, and I wanted to cry because it was so violating. My husband started documenting everything. Photos, dates, a folder, romance. Around that time, I found out I was pregnant. I took a test in our bathroom while my husband was at the grocery store. And when the line showed up, I sat on the floor and stared at it like it was a prank. I felt joy and terror, and the sharp little grief that my relationship with my parents was collapsing right when I was about to become a parent. When I told my husband, he hugged me and laughed and cried at the same time. And then we both got quiet because we knew what the news meant. My family would find out eventually. They were the kind of people who watched from the shadows. We shared the pregnancy news with friends in our circle. A couple photos, a caption, nothing crazy. I didn't even think about my parents seeing it because I'd blocked them. But extended relatives exist, and people love to gossip. A few days later, on a random Tuesday afternoon, my husband came home early and his face looked wrong. He said, "Your sister was on the porch." He said she was sitting there like she belonged there, like she was waiting for him to come talk. He got back in his car and drove off, and she ran after the car yelling his name. Hearing that made my stomach drop. So hard I thought I might actually faint. Pregnancy hormones plus fear is a really ugly combo. By the way, even before that porch incident, my sister had been doing these tiny performances whenever we saw her. She'd bring my husband a drink he didn't ask for. She'd laugh at his jokes a little too hard. She'd talk about how no one understands her, while looking straight at him like he was her audience. My mother would watch it with this pleased expression that made me feel like I was watching someone set a trap in slow motion. My father would nudge conversations back to my sister's loneliness. And honestly, for a second, it almost worked because pity is my weakness. Then I'd remember the letters, the hovering, the way my marriage had been treated like a shared resource, and the pity would harden into something else. We finally called the police after weeks of letters stacking up on our counter, and that night of her pacing on our porch like she still had a key to our lives. It was not some dramatic movie moment. No shouting or dragging anyone away. Just 2 exhausted people sitting on our own couch, telling an officer that a relative would not stop showing up and scaring us. He listened, took notes, asked how long it had been going on, and did that little slow nod people do when they realize you did not jump straight to calling. He said, "A lot of people in your situation wait too long because they do not want to be cruel to family, and I felt my face burn because that was exactly what had kept me quiet." He explained how a restraining order worked, what we would have to document, and he told us to keep every letter and text from that point on. It felt weirdly validating and humiliating at the same time, like filing a report on my own childhood. We met with a lawyer, nothing fancy, just a person in an office who told us what we could realistically do. We filed for a restraining order. My hands shook the whole time we filled out forms, because even though it was necessary, it also felt like crossing a line you can't uncross. It's your sister. It's your parents. It's your childhood. And now you're writing it down in legal language, like it's a case file. I hated it. I also wanted to sleep for the first time in months. My parents showed up to the hearing acting like grieving saints. My mother cried softly. My father looked stern and offended. My sister looked fragile and victimized, wearing this expression like she'd been wronged by the world. The judge asked questions. We presented the letters. My husband explained the porch incident. I talked about the pattern over the years. And I could hear my voice tremble, and I hated myself for it because I didn't want to look weak, but also I was scared. I was pregnant. I felt vulnerable in a way I wasn't used to. The restraining order was granted. My sister was told not to contact us, not to come near our home, not to go to my husband's workplace, nothing. My parents paid bail when my sister got arrested for trespassing later that week because apparently she couldn't help herself. She violated the order almost immediately. A neighbor saw her lurking near our driveway and called it in. The officer who showed up recognized her name from the earlier report and looked annoyed. I felt small, and then I felt angry at myself for still letting them get to me. Like, why do I always default to guilt? I need a new personality trait. Because the truth was my sister had choices. My parents had choices. They chose this. They chose obsession over boundaries, comfort over accountability. When my sister got taken away the second time, my mother called me and left this voicemail that sounded like she was choking. She said I was destroying the family. She said my sister was sick and I should have more compassion. She said I was punishing them for a misunderstanding. I listened to it while sitting in my car in a parking lot, and I laughed. Like, actually laughed. Because my whole life my sister's pain had been treated like an emergency, and my pain had been treated like a personality flaw. At the next hearing, because yes, there was another one, my sister cried dramatically and said she just wanted to talk. She said I'd always been the favorite and she'd always been ignored. Which is such a wild rewrite of history, I almost lost my mind. The judge didn't care about her speech. He cared about the fact that she violated an order. He gave her a short jail sentence and mandatory therapy. Not forever, not some movie punishment. Just enough to make it clear that, but I'm sad, doesn't excuse harassment. Walking out of that courthouse, my husband squeezed my hand and asked if I was okay. I said I don't know. And then I started crying in the hallway like a person who had finally run out of adrenaline. A stranger handed me tissues. That's how low-key and humiliating it all was. Not cinematic, just human mess. While all of that was happening, my parents' marriage started cracking in a way that felt both inevitable and weirdly sad. My mother blamed my father for betraying her years ago and said if he hadn't done that, the family wouldn't have this pattern of disrespect. My father blamed my mother for being too soft on my sister after the hospital incident. They fought about money, about therapy bills, about bail, about the humiliation of relatives finding out. It wasn't like I felt joy about it, but I also couldn't pretend I didn't see it coming. They built a family around denial, and denial is expensive. Eventually, the bill shows up. My mother filed for divorce, just like that. One day, my aunt called and said, "Your parents are separating." Like she was reporting the weather. My mother moved out, first to stay with a relative in another state. My father stayed in the house because my sister couldn't leave the state due to the court stuff, and he wanted to be available. My father went back to work because apparently their retirement savings had gotten wrecked paying for everything, and he struggled to find something decent because he'd been out of the workforce so long. My mother found a job, too, something lower pay than she'd ever accepted before. And I could almost hear the bitterness in her voice through other people's gossip. Extended family split into camps. Some relatives thought I was cruel for involving the court. Some thought my parents deserved it for how they'd enabled my sister. I got messages from people I barely knew telling me to forgive and keep family together. And I wanted to respond, okay, you take them then. But I didn't. I ignored them. I had a baby growing inside me and a life to protect. Also, pregnancy nausea does not leave room for internet debates. When our daughter was born, everything got quieter in my head for a while. Not because problems disappear when you have a baby. They don't. They just come with less sleep. But because holding her felt like stepping into a different era. She was warm and tiny and real. And I looked at her and thought, I'm not doing this cycle. I'm not making her feel like love has a price tag. I'm not measuring her worth with a stopwatch. My father tried to reach out once. He sent a message that said, congratulations. I hope she's healthy. That was it. No apology, no accountability, just a neutral sentence like we were neighbors who'd had a mild disagreement about trash bins. I didn't respond. My mother didn't reach out at all. My sister, from what I heard through my aunt, was in therapy and working on herself, which could mean anything. She was also furious at me, apparently, and told people I stole her life. Like my husband was an object she'd ordered and I'd received by mistake. Sometimes late at night, when the baby finally slept and the house was quiet, I'd feel this old ache in my chest. Not because I missed my parents as they were, but because I missed the idea that I could have had normal parents. I'd scroll through old photos on my phone, birthdays, holidays, my wedding, trying to spot the moment where things went wrong. And the annoying part is it wasn't one moment. It was 1,000 small choices, 1,000 tiny comparisons. 1,000 times my father chose silence and my mother chose control, and my sister chose resentment. Now, when a car slows down on our street, my body still tenses. When the doorbell rings unexpectedly, I still flinch. I hate that. I hate that my family left that imprint on me. But I also feel something else underneath it. This stubborn little strength I didn't know I had, because I did the thing nobody does in family stories. I made it official. I drew a line. I picked my own home over my parents' comfort. And I won't pretend it feels good all the time. Some days it feels lonely. Some days it feels like relief. Most days it feels like both. But when I look at my daughter, I know one thing for sure. If anyone ever tries to make her feel small the way my sister felt small, I will burn the whole table down before I let it happen. Metaphorically, calm down. After our daughter was born, my body felt like it belonged to someone else for a while. Hormones, sleep deprivation, the whole messy miracle. I'd be rocking her at 3 a.m, staring at the dim hallway light, and I'd suddenly remember my mother's stopwatch and feel this irrational rage, like the sound could still reach me through years and walls. My husband would wake up and find me crying silently, and he'd say, "What happened?" And I'd whisper, "Nothing," because explaining my family felt like dragging dirt across clean sheets. My mother tried to re-enter through the baby. She sent a package to our house with tiny clothes and a card that said, "For my granddaughter." No apology, no acknowledgement, just a gift like we were in some normal grandparent situation. I held the box and felt my hand shake. Part of me wanted to text her and say, "Thank you," because manners are my curse. Another part of me wanted to mail it back with a note that said, "You don't get access to my child while disrespecting me." I ended up donating the clothes to a local shelter, and then I cried in the car because I felt like I'd thrown away a piece of my own childhood. Same feeling as always, like I had done something unforgivable just by existing. My aunt visited once, quietly without drama. She held the baby and smiled and said she was sorry for how things turned out. She didn't push me to forgive. She didn't tell me to be the bigger person. She just listened. That meant more than any grand speech. She told me some relatives had cut my parents off, not because they suddenly became moral warriors, but because they didn't want the chaos near them. My parents' reputation in their community had taken a hit, and suddenly they were learning what it feels like to be judged. It wasn't poetic justice. It was just consequences. My father tried again months later to meet the baby. He left a voicemail saying he'd be in town and he wanted to stop by. I didn't respond. He showed up anyway, because boundaries are apparently suggestions to him. He stood on the porch and knocked. My husband looked at me, waiting. I felt my pulse in my throat. I held my daughter against my chest and stared at the door like it was a wall between two worlds. My husband opened it, just enough to talk. Not enough to let him in. My father said he missed me. My husband said, Delaney doesn't want to see you. My father said, I'm her father. My husband said, then act like it. And my father just stood there blinking like he couldn't compute. He left eventually. A couple weeks after that porch visit, my sister's therapist apparently suggested she write an accountability letter. That's what my aunt called it, like it was a cute project. My aunt asked if I'd want to read it. I said no, not because I didn't care, but because I knew how my family operates. One vague apology, and suddenly they act like the entire past gets erased. I wasn't doing that. I told my aunt I hoped my sister got better, truly. But I wasn't reopening the door just because someone told her the right therapy words. My aunt respected it. My parents, from what I heard, did not. They started telling people I was holding grudges, like boundaries are a character flaw. I let them talk. Let them make me the villain. At least this time, I wasn't living in their house under their stopwatch, trying to earn the right to breathe. After that call, I sat on the floor, shaking. And I realized something weird. I wasn't scared of him. I was scared of how easily I'd slip back into being the version of me who tries to fix everything. That's what I was protecting myself from. Not just my family's chaos, but my own conditioning. I still have moments where I imagine a different version of this story. One where my mother apologized genuinely. One where my father grew a spine. One where my sister got help without turning me into her enemy. But that's not the story I got. The story I got is the one where I had to choose my peace over my family's comfort and then live with the grief of that choice. The closest thing to closure is this: my home is quiet now. Not perfect, not free of stress, but quiet in the way I dreamed about when I was a kid listening to my sister cry behind a bathroom door. My daughter won't grow up with a stopwatch on the counter. If she struggles, I won't punish her into compliance. If she thrives, I won't use her as a weapon. I'll mess up sometimes because I'm human, but I'll own it. And if my family ever tries to pull the same old tricks with her, I'll do what I did for myself. I'll shut the door. And yes, some nights I still feel sad. Some nights I feel relieved. Most nights I feel tired. But the tired feels mine, not assigned. That's the difference. That's the whole difference. This was a long, painful road, and honestly, sharing it feels incredibly vulnerable. Have any of you ever had to draw such a hard line with your family to protect yourself or your own? What did that look like for you? I really want to know if I'm alone in this. Tell me your thoughts in the comments.